That the goal in his mind was
the memory of their beautiful. This was
my opponent wants
conflict with Iran continues.
Up the next generation with a
name. The event was organized around what the administration calls Trump accounts, the child investment accounts created by the Republican tax and spending package passed by Congress. What the president delivered, though, ranged far beyond savings policy. He described the ongoing confrontation with Iran. He spoke about a dignified transfer ceremony at Dover Air Force Base for 4 American service members. He endorsed a slate of Georgia Republican candidates, and he urged Senate Republicans to change the rules of their own chamber.
That's good, Scott. Don't make a...
The question I want to work through with you is straightforward. What was actually announced, what was a claim, and what remains unresolved? Let me start with the policy at the center of the event, because it is the reason the president traveled to Georgia.
Making America great again. Maybe the most important man in this room right now is not here. His name is Mike Collins, and he's going...
Trump accounts are tax-advantaged investment accounts for American children, established under the tax law the president signed and which he referred to throughout his remarks as the Big, Beautiful Bill. According to the description he gave from the stage, every newborn American child receives a $1,000 deposit from the federal government at birth. Parents, grandparents, employers, and other relatives may contribute up to $5,000 per year. The money is invested and can be accessed when the child reaches adulthood, at 18 or 21, depending on how the funds are used. The president offered several figures on how the program is performing. He said the complex legal and administrative work behind the accounts was completed only a matter of weeks ago, and that more than 7 million children have already been enrolled.
Tell them to get this stuff approved. So we're fighting so that all voters must show...
He also said that in the 18 days before the event, close to $1.5 billion had been deposited into the accounts. He directed viewers to a government website where parents can register a child, and he claimed the associated application had become the most downloaded app in the country. I want to be clear about the status of those numbers. They were presented by the president himself, and the material available does not include independent verification of the enrollment or deposit totals. He also described private contributions to the program. He said that Michael and Susan Dell had donated $6.25 billion to fund accounts for children, and he mentioned the investor Brad Gerstner, saying Gerstner is considering funding accounts for children across an entire state, with Indiana named as the example under discussion. That, by the president's own framing, is something being looked at rather than something completed. He added that other wealthy individuals have made smaller donations. These are described as philanthropic commitments, and the details of how such contributions would be distributed and to which children were not spelled out in the remarks. To illustrate the program, the president invited 2 Georgia families onto the stage. Cole and Allison Loden appeared with their 3 children, Ray, Rex, and Ren. The president said the couple met at Kennesaw State University, that Cole now works as a project manager helping build data centers, and that the family purchased their first home earlier this year. Cole Loden thanked the president and encouraged other eligible parents to open accounts for their children and keep contributing each year.
We went from the highest price 1 year ago, the highest priced drugs anywhere in the world, like the fat drug. It cost, think of it.
Dean and Gabriel also appeared with their 4 children, Elise, Jude, Isaiah, and Talia. Dean described arriving in the area with his family in 1990, losing his job in 2008, learning the appliance repair trade, and later building both a service company and a technology business. Now to what I would call the most concrete new announcement of the day, and it did not come from the president. Rick Jackson, a Georgia business leader running for governor, took the stage and said that if he is elected, he will push the state of Georgia to match the federal $1,000 contribution with another $1,000 per child. He said he believes the state legislature would approve such a measure, and that if lawmakers did not, he would personally fund the contribution himself. I want to underline the conditional nature of that pledge. It depends on his winning the governorship, and any state match would still require action by the Georgia General Assembly. Nothing has been enacted. Jackson also used his time to discuss pharmaceutical supply chains, and his account is worth summarizing carefully. He said his company purchased what he described as the last remaining American antibiotics manufacturing plant in 2021, out of concern that production capacity could otherwise be used as leverage by China. He said the company produces a single dose of amoxicillin for about 7 cents, but that by the time it moves through intermediaries, the consumer pays roughly $1. He recounted raising this with White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, who he said told him about the administration's direct-to-consumer drug purchasing initiative. He also contrasted regulatory timelines under the previous and current administrations. Those comparisons are his characterization. To understand why the administration is putting this much weight on a savings program, we need to look back at how it came to be. The accounts were one provision inside a much larger tax law, and the president presented that law as the largest tax cut in American history. He said the measure passed with unanimous Republican support and without Democratic votes, and he repeatedly framed the accounts as something his opponents had declined to back. That framing is a political argument about a recorded legislative vote, and Democratic lawmakers have generally described the broader package differently, pointing to its overall cost and distribution rather than to the child accounts alone. The president spent considerable time on the other provisions of that same law, and he tailored the figures to his Georgia audience. He said that during the most recent filing season, roughly 130,000 tipped workers in Georgia saved an average of more than $7,000 because of the no tax on tips provision. He said about 700,000 Georgia workers saved an average of more than $3,000 under the no tax on overtime provision, and that around 500,000 Georgia seniors paid nothing on their Social Security benefits. He also highlighted a deduction he said was his own idea, allowing buyers to deduct interest on loans for vehicles manufactured in the United States. That brings us to the wider economic picture he presented. The president said his administration has secured more than $19.2 trillion in new investment commitments, and he contrasted that with what he described as far less than $1 trillion over 4 years under his predecessor. He said the stock market has recorded 73 all-time highs since the election, and that a typical American retirement account has gained about $34,000. He also said inflation fell last week by the largest amount in more than 6 years. These are the administration's numbers as delivered in a campaign-style setting, and investment commitments in particular are announcements of intent rather than money already spent. He listed specific corporate announcements tied to Georgia. He said the pharmaceutical company, UCB, is investing $2 billion to build its first American manufacturing facility in Gwinnett County.
Education back to the States. Linda McMahon, and she's phenomenal.
He referenced a $600 million Japanese investment in an advanced diamond processing facility in the state and said Yamaha Motors is building a new United States headquarters in Kennesaw. He also said Toyota is moving operations out of Mexico and plans to build what he called the largest plant anywhere in the world. Project announcements of this kind typically unfold over years, and the timelines, final locations, and job totals are the details worth tracking as they are confirmed. I want to pause here on a moment in the remarks that was different in tone from everything around it. Before arriving in Georgia, The president said he attended a dignified transfer ceremony at Dover Air Force Base for 4 United States service members killed in the conflict with Iran. He named one of them, Lieutenant Tyler Feehan, and said he had met the young officer's mother, Sherry, his father, Stephen, and his uncle David. The president said the family was traveling to Georgia, that they live close to Marietta, and that he offered them seats aboard Air Force One. The family was present at the event, and the president told the audience that he considers those ceremonies the most difficult part of the job. That leads directly to the conflict itself and to the language the president chose. He described the confrontation with the Islamic Republic of Iran as a skirmish, saying Iranian officials want to reach an agreement, but are not, in his assessment, ready to finalize one, because in his words, they seek to change terms after they are set.
Like I say, we respected maybe like never before. When I took office, we inherited the worst border in U.S. history. It was an open wound.
He said he expects them to be ready soon. He also made a claim about internal repression in Iran, saying that more than 52,000 protesters have been killed over the past 4 months, and he criticized news organizations for not covering it. That figure was not accompanied by a source in his remarks, and I have no independent confirmation of it to offer you. He connected that conflict to energy policy through Venezuela. The president said the United States is now working with Venezuela on oil production, describing it as a partnership in which large volumes of crude are being shipped to refineries in Houston and Louisiana. He said American energy companies are signing agreements there and named Energy Secretary Chris Wright, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent as officials involved. He then made a striking claim, saying that the United States and Venezuela together account for roughly 62% of the world oil market, which he argued reduces American dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. Independent energy data would need to be checked against that characterization, and he did not detail the terms of the arrangement. On immigration and public safety, the president presented a series of statistics. He said the administration turned what he called the worst border situation in American history into the most secure border in the country's history within 2 months. He said figures show that over the past 14 months, no migrants have been admitted illegally into the United States. He said the flow of fentanyl across the border has been cut by 67%, and that drugs arriving by sea have been reduced by 97%.
A laundry list of accomplishments, and he listed Iran as one of the areas that the United States is, in his mind, winning. He said the goal in his mind was to ensure that
10%. He also said last year produced the largest recorded drop in the murder rate, bringing it to the lowest level since 1900. Each of these is an administration claim rather than a figure I can verify from the material provided. He also raised 2 specific criminal cases in Georgia, describing an arrest in Clayton County involving a man from Mexico who is in the country illegally and who has been charged in a shooting that left victims wounded, and a separate arrest involving a man accused of assaulting a child. I want to state plainly what these are. They are charges and arrests, not convictions, and the cases remain before the courts. The president used them to criticize Senator Jon Ossoff, saying the senator and congressional Democrats voted to reduce funding for immigration and customs enforcement. Senator Ossoff has not, in the available material, responded to that characterization, and votes described in campaign speeches often involve broader legislation than the summary suggests. There is also a housing argument embedded in the immigration section, and it is worth explaining because it connects to cost of living. The president said that under the previous administration, more than 60% of the increase in rental housing costs was driven by migration, and that federal money was spent housing migrants while some veterans struggled to find housing. He then said rents in the Atlanta area are now down by more than 10% compared with their peak. Housing economists generally attribute rent movements to a mix of supply, interest rates, wages, and local construction, so the single cause explanation he offered is a political framing rather than a settled economic finding. He also outlined changes to health spending. The president said the administration ended Medicaid eligibility for immigrants in the country illegally and redirected $50 billion into what he described as the largest rural health investment in American history, funding hospitals in areas he said had been neglected. He said Vice President J.D. Vance is leading what the administration calls a war on fraud, aimed at recovering money lost to improper payments. Those are described as completed policy actions rather than proposals, and the practical test will be how quickly rural facilities actually receive funds and whether the fraud recovery effort produces measurable results that can be independently audited over time. Prescription drug pricing took up a significant portion of the speech, and this is one of the areas where the president was most detailed about process.
Mr. President, you're fighting for Georgia.
He described a most favored nation policy, meaning the United States would pay no more than the lowest price paid by other wealthy nations. He said he pressed pharmaceutical companies to accept it, and then pressured other governments to raise their own prices so the gap would close. He gave an account of a conversation with French President Emmanuel Macron in which, he said, he threatened a 200% tariff on French wine and champagne before Macron agreed. He said, Americans can now compare prices through a government drug purchasing website. He illustrated the point with an anecdote about a wealthy acquaintance who, he said, paid roughly $1,400 in New York for a weight loss medication that cost about $87 in London, produced by the same company at the same facility.
But perhaps most consequential of all is the provision that the great, big, beautiful bill that we're celebrating today. It's something that's beautiful.
The president said reductions of 70, 80, and in one case, 90% are now available on certain medications. I would encourage anyone hearing figures like that to check them against their own prescriptions and pharmacy, because savings on drug pricing programs typically vary by medication, by insurance status, and by whether a generic alternative already exists. The president himself suggested comparing the listed price with a local pharmacy. He then moved to a proposal rather than an accomplishment, and the distinction matters. The president said Republicans intend to pass what he called a great health care plan, which would stop federal payments flowing to large insurance companies and instead direct money to individuals so they can purchase their own coverage.
We're here today, and I said to them, celebrating the memory of their beautiful, this was a beautiful son. You know, I read, when I go to Dover, I read.
He argued this would produce better care at lower cost and described the Affordable Care Act as failing. That plan has not been introduced, debated, or voted on according to anything in his remarks. It is a stated legislative intention. How such a system would treat people with existing medical conditions and what would happen to those with high-cost care needs was not addressed. The political purpose of the visit was never far from the surface, and the Senate race in Georgia was central to it. The president urged support for Congressman Mike Collins, who is challenging Senator Jon Ossoff. Collins was not present, and the president explained why, saying he had personally told the congressman to remain in Washington for a narrowly divided vote on military and agricultural matters. The president used a dismissive nickname for the senator throughout, which I am not going to repeat, and he recounted his involvement in a previous Georgia race years ago in which, he said, his endorsement forced Ossoff's earlier congressional bid into a runoff that Ossoff lost. The rest of the Georgia slate received similar attention. Beyond Rick Jackson for governor, the president endorsed State Senator Brian Strickland for Attorney General, State Senator Greg Dolezal for Lieutenant Governor, State Representative Tim Fleming for Secretary of State, and State Representative Houston Gaines for Congress, noting that Gaines had already won his primary. He also acknowledged administration figures in attendance, including Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Education Secretary Linda McMahon, Small Business Administration Head Kelly Loeffler, and United States Treasurer Brandon Beach, a former Georgia state senator. He praised McMahon specifically for what he described as moving education authority back to state and local control, a process he said remains underway. Other guests reflected the political and cultural mix of the event. Cobb County School Superintendent Chris Ragsdale was recognized, along with the conservative organizer Ralph Reed, whose group the president credited with a large voter contact effort in the state, the attorney David Schoen, and Alveda King. The Atlanta Braves were also represented by Chief Executive Mike Plant and manager Brian Snitker, who the president said was recently inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Snitker told the crowd the team presented the president with an anniversary jersey and expressed hope of returning to Washington with a championship. It was a reminder that these events blend policy, campaigning, and local identity in equal measure.
Now I want to address the sharpest political language of the day, because it will shape coverage. The president repeatedly described his opponents not as socialists but as communists, and said he considers that ideology the single greatest threat the country has faced. He referenced a recent address he delivered at Mount Rushmore and argued that his political opponents want to raise taxes rather than lower them, which he called an unusual campaign message. These are political characterizations, and Democratic officials reject the description entirely, describing their own agenda in terms of affordability, health coverage, and taxation of higher earners. I am presenting his framing so you know what was said, not as a factual finding.
Not ready to make a deal. Because every time they make a deal, they want to change it and everything. They're not ready. They'll be ready very soon.
Election procedure formed the final policy block, and this is where the president was most explicit about what he wants from his own party. He called for passage of legislation he referred to as the Save America Act, which he said the House has approved 3 times under Speaker Mike Johnson, but which has stalled in the Senate. He wants a requirement that all voters present identification, a proof of citizenship requirement, and an end to mail-in voting, with exceptions he specified for illness, disability, military deployment, and travel. He also said Republicans are working to include as much of that plan as possible in the budget bill now being assembled. Then came the request that carries the widest institutional consequences. The president urged Senate Republicans to eliminate the filibuster, the rule requiring 60 votes to advance most legislation, and to approve his agenda immediately. He said Democrats would abolish it themselves at the first opportunity, and then admit the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico as states, which he estimated would add 4 senators, roughly 12 House members, and a significant block of electoral votes. He named Senate Majority Leader John Thune and encouraged supporters to contact him directly. He also warned of a possible government shutdown in September and a debt ceiling confrontation 2 years later. There was one more item that drew attention, and it concerns the White House itself. The president described construction of a large new facility on the grounds, which he called a ballroom, but also described as having military functions, including a drone landing area on the roof. He said it is being funded by wealthy individuals and companies rather than taxpayers, and that hundreds of workers are on site from early morning until late at night. He used that construction crew to illustrate the overtime tax provision, saying he told the workers directly that their additional hours are no longer taxed. The project's full cost, design, and completion date were not detailed. So who is actually affected by all of this, and how? For parents of newborns, the immediate question is whether to open an account, and the answer depends on their own savings capacity, since the federal deposit alone is modest, and the growth the president described assumes years of additional contributions and favorable market returns. For tipped and hourly workers and for retirees, the tax provisions are already reflected in filings. For Georgia families specifically, the proposed state match would double the initial deposit, but only if a future legislature approves it. For patients, the drug pricing changes may or may not apply to their particular medication, which is why individual comparison matters more than headline percentages. There are questions I expect many of you are asking, and I want to answer them honestly. Are Trump accounts automatic at birth? The president described the federal deposit as automatic for eligible newborns, while enrollment through the government portal is what allows families to manage and contribute. Will the accounts really be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars? That was the president's projection, and it depends entirely on contribution levels and long-term market performance, neither of which can be guaranteed.
We want to give you the money directly. Buy your own health care. What's happening is these insurance companies take in billions and billions of dollars, and they don't give a damn.
Can the money be used for anything? He referenced access at 18 or 21, but the detailed rules on qualified uses were not laid out in these remarks. What has changed then is mostly a matter of emphasis and momentum. The savings program is operating. Enrollment is being reported in the millions. Private donors have committed funds, and a leading candidate for governor of Georgia has publicly proposed a state match. What has not changed is the legislative arithmetic in Washington.
And under the system, every newborn child gets $1,000 deposited in their Trump account at birth.
The election legislation remains blocked in the Senate. The healthcare plan has not been written into a bill. The filibuster remains in place. The confrontation with Iran continues without a concluded agreement, and the human cost of it was visible at this very event in the presence of a Georgia family that had just returned from Dover. That is why I would keep watching several specific things over the coming weeks. Whether the Georgia legislature takes up a matching contribution, and whether it does so before or after the election. Whether Senate Republicans respond to the president's call on the filibuster, and whether Majority Leader Thune signals any movement. Whether the September funding deadline produces a shutdown or a negotiated extension. Whether enrollment and deposit figures for the accounts are published in a form that can be independently reviewed. And whether the diplomatic track with Iran produces the agreement the president says he expects, or whether the current phase continues. Thank you for watching my report on President Trump's remarks in Marietta, Georgia, and on the Trump Accounts program at the center of that event. This is a story with several moving parts, from a proposed state-matching contribution to unresolved fights in the Senate and an ongoing conflict abroad. And the next official announcements should tell us a great deal about which of these commitments become policy. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow every verified update as this story develops.